So in my early 20s, I was sat on a flight alone for the first time in my life, absolutely terrified. I kept having thoughts like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this alone? That trip changed everything. Since then, I've taken solo trips to countries in Asia and Europe, and I've currently been travelling in Latin America solo for the past year. Getting on that flight has probably been the single best decision of my 20s. In this video, I'm going to share why I think solo travel in your 20s can literally change your life, and also some hard lessons that I've learned along the way. So yeah, my first solo trip actually happened very last minute. Basically, it was just after the first peak of the COVID pandemic. I think it was in 2021, and flights in the UK had just started becoming available to go towards Europe for tourism, basically. Basically, I just had a week off work with 2 weekends with 2 different tickets for Scotland rugby matches in Edinburgh. So I decided why not have a look at some last minute flights on Skyscanner. And I found return flights to Budapest from Edinburgh Airport for £13 sterling. So yeah, I decided because it was so cheap, I just had no excuse to just jump at the opportunity and give it a go. But what seemed like a great idea initially, actually when I got on the flight, I remember thinking, like, what are you doing, Callum? What are you doing on this flight by yourself? You've got no friends, you've got no plans, you're not going to be meeting anyone there, like, this is going to suck, basically. So yeah, I got into Budapest, got the public transport to my hostel, and this was my first time in a hostel. And you know, I get shown my bunk bed and things like that, and then there's another person in there, just one person, and he says, "Are you solo traveling?" And I say, "Yeah, I'm a solo traveler." He's like, "Oh, okay, let's link up, let's do some stuff today." And from that point on, a lot of my fears and worries started to melt away. Yeah, so meeting this guy, this other solo traveler, led to us going out and doing stuff, meeting other people out in the city. It actually led to one of the most social holidays I guess I'd had at that point. Meeting loads of new people from all around the world, different cultures, different backgrounds. Yeah, so this trip really sort of shone a light for me on the potential of what solo travel can offer in comparison with other types of travel. And yeah, basically I fell in love with it, and from that day and kept wanting to do more and more. So yeah, this brings me on to the first real point of why go solo traveling when you can go traveling with your friends or linking with others. Maybe as a couple, you don't feel alone. You have people that you know there. You're sharing the experiences. You're sharing those memories with people who you've known for a long time. And it's true, that is super special. And I love going on holidays with my friends and family as well. But yeah, the real advantage is that it stops you waiting on others to give you the permission to do some trip that you want to do. You know, planning group holidays can sometimes feel like 4D chess, trying to manage everyone's schedules and find the right dates where everyone's got time off work and etc, etc. Whereas with solo travel, you are the captain of your own ship. You decide where you want to go, when you want to go, with minimal disruptions or with minimal sacrifice, I guess. You know, and as an example, the last sort of group holiday that I was on was not a big group, but a small group. Was a sort of staycation in Scotland, cycle packing trips around the islands of Scotland, basically, over 2 summers. And those holidays were great, and I always hold those memories really near and dear to my heart. But sometimes it feels like you have to sell the holiday to your friends to get people interested, and then once you have the interest, trying to figure out what date suits everyone and stuff. And you know, the holiday only lasts like 5-6 days, and then it's done and dusted. And it's very much, you know, you have to plan everything in advance, have everything sort of kind of like scheduled in to make sure everyone's happy with what's going on, which is totally fair. But yeah, as a juxtaposition to that, like being on this long trip out in Latin America and being able to decide what I want to do and when. You know, for example, I was in a city in Bolivia called Sucre that I didn't really know how long I was going to stay there for, and I ended up extending my time there for 1 month just because I liked it so much. And for example, the quality of food, how cheap everything was, how good the Spanish lessons were there. So I just decided I'm going to stay here, which might have been more complicated if I was with other people, with friends, with people I'd met on the road, with a partner. But yeah, because I was solo and I wanted to do it, I could do it. So yeah, it really does just offer a sense of freedom that's really difficult to get in group situations, group holidays. On to my next point, which I think is one of the most important, is that solo travel is like a self-improvement machine. You know, I'm going to butcher this quote, but it's from some sort of video or book from Mark Manson, and he says that, you know, if your life still sucks on a beach in Bali and it's the same back home, then, I mean, the common denominator is you. Solo travel really strips away all the distractions that you might have back home or the expectations that are upon you when you're back home. And what's left is you, and you have to deal with that. You know, sometimes solo travel, especially when you're by yourself for a long time, it can feel like it's literally like strips you naked and therefore kind of teaches you what you really value, but like really, without outside influences. For example, when I was on a short solo trip to Lisbon in Portugal, I had a bit of a crisis. You know, I was there for a week and I did enjoy the city and things, but I realised that the experience just felt a bit empty. This led me to look inward a bit as to why I wasn't enjoying myself in this amazing city. Basically, I realised that I was just burnt out from all the moving around I'd been doing. Because with my job at the time, I was a project engineer and away on projects for maybe, you know, over 100 odd days a year. So, and then as soon as the projects were finishing, out of my, you know, my own free will, but I did this to myself, I would go, you know, straight on a holiday when I had time to take off, or straight to a new country. But this meant, like, where I was living at the time in Glasgow, I didn't really have much roots, no real close friendships, no groups, nothing, no sense of community. So this sort of realisation made me actually take more action in trying to spend more time in Glasgow, in the city I was living in, to build some roots, to meet new people. So yeah, this led me to actually, funnily enough, stop travelling as much, join a club in Glasgow, joined a salsa school. Met some really nice people, had a little friend group there, and I just felt like I was more at home. And because of that, I enjoyed my time there, and I looked forward to getting back there after work or while I was working there. Like, it made me more content in my day-to-day life. So yeah, being solo in Portugal and Lisbon, in a beautiful city, and realising I was still sad. This really helped me with introspection and trying to understand what was wrong and actually coming up with a good solution. On to my next point is that when you solo travel, your worldview expands. You know, you learn about different people with different backgrounds, with different cultures, different ways of thinking. For example, recently I was having a conversation with someone from Peru about his identity crisis as a Peruvian. So basically he was saying that with his mixed roots, with the indigenous roots and also the Spanish and other European sort of influences, it made him question who he was quite a lot through his youth. And he said this can be quite a common occurrence in people from Latin America, Latinos, especially since there's this like historic spite against the Spanish who, you know, conquered Latin America and imposed all these things on the indigenous people. But, you know, technically having that as part of your heritage as well as being indigenous, it's these conversations that really kind of open your mind and spark these things like, wow, this is actually what people think here. This is the reality. Is, you know, hearing it from the horse's mouth. It's impossible to compare to learning from books or in the media or anything like that. Another part of this worldview expansion is that you realise that the media really over-exaggerates the negative press in countries. You know, for example, when I started this trip in Colombia and I really wanted to visit Ecuador, but all the press was super negative and, you know, tourists shouldn't go there, and there was tourist boards from Europe who were advising against citizens to going to Ecuador, especially the coast. And, you know, even I did hear some horror stories from travellers who'd been to Ecuador. But in reality, even though, yes, there's dangerous places in Ecuador and things that you shouldn't do in X, Y, and Z, I didn't feel any more unsafe than when I was in Colombia when I was there. And I ended up having an amazing time, and I'm really glad that I almost ignored these bad stories and just went. You know, it was the same when I was in Bolivia. There's an economic and political crisis in Bolivia when I was there, and still ongoing, and that is real. There was some real suffering of the local people at the time there, and there were blockades and things like that. But I never felt unsafe in Bolivia, never, as a tourist. People were lovely, had amazing experiences there. But yeah, the way that the media portrays countries when they have these problems is that they're just like, you should never go there, you're going to get robbed as soon as you cross the border. But in reality, if you have your head on straight and you have common sense, these countries are visitable and you can have such an amazing time there. So yeah, you realise firsthand that you shouldn't believe everything that's in the news, basically. Or at least take it with some pinch of salt, some realisation that this isn't too relevant if you're a tourist in the country. And also, travel actually gives you a bigger appreciation for what you have at home. You know, I've met a fair few people during this trip from Venezuela, from Bolivia in particular, who had some really, really tough stories to tell about their past, about their history, about their country, about where they're from. And, you know, speaking as a Scotsman, or technically from the UK with my passport, yeah, British politics can be not great, and things might not be ideal, and it's definitely not perfect back home. Like, we do have our own problems. But yeah, comparing the problems that we have to like some of these countries, like the political systems in Venezuela and the problems and the economic crisis in Bolivia, when you actually speak to the people, like hear it from the horse's mouth, like it really does make you realise like how lucky you are to be born where you're born. At least in my case, being born as a British citizen, like having a British passport, it's like a gift. And it's literally pure chance, like where you're born. Like it makes me feel like way more appreciative from where I'm from. You know, I had Venezuelan Spanish tutors when I was in Colombia who had basically fled their country as refugees essentially to Colombia because they couldn't eat. And when I was in Bolivia, I had the honour of going on like a sort of tour of the uni with a Bolivian couple, lovely Bolivian couple who's same age as me, who were university educated, who had their own business in graphic design. They were struggling to meet ends meet. They were struggling to pay for medical bills for their loved ones who were ill. So the girl was telling me how she is looking for opportunities abroad and trying to, you know, go away to work, to send money back home to help her loved ones. And just how difficult it is being a Bolivian citizen to try and get visas now because of the political situation, the economic situation. And yeah, the conversation led to her, you know, getting really emotional and yeah, actually having these intimate like conversations and about someone's life, like actually seeing it and feeling the consequences, like, you know, and it's not their fault. It's just because, you know, their country, their leaders, the politicians have basically fucked it up for them. It's just difficult to imagine for me being from Scotland, like having to like forced to leave my country, which I love, just because I have no other option. And that really is such an important lesson to learn, I think, as a young person, is to actually appreciate, or to have gratitude in general, but to really appreciate, like, if you're born in one of these countries, like, you have a fucking golden ticket, and you should really, really respect that, instead of complaining about petty politics, in my opinion. Hot take, you know, there's also the practical benefits of the skills and things that you pick up during these experiences by yourself. One, for example, is a bit more minimalism. I literally live out of 2 bags. One is 40 litres, the other is 18 litres. And I live quite comfortably out of those 2 bags. And I've been on the road for almost a year now. You know, you realise how much clutter and shite you have back home that you don't really need in your day-to-day life, which I think is a good thing to be at least conscious of. Another thing is how it improves your social skills. You know, you're going into dorms by yourself a lot of the time. You're having to meet new people, new faces, interact with people with different cultures. Really does build your confidence in this aspect, and also helps you to build like a global network. A lot of people, you're exchanging numbers, you're exchanging social media, you're promising to visit each other in the future in their country of origin. You know, another one I think from solo travel that I've taken in terms of a skill is that I now speak Spanish. I don't think I really would have sparked this initial interest in speaking another language if I hadn't done these solo trips before and met all these polyglots who can speak French, Spanish, English, German, whatever. It kind of made me realise that if these guys can do it, like, it is possible. It is definitely possible. There's not some sort of like magic languages gene. Yeah, so in terms of the inspiration and also obviously the living in a Spanish-speaking countries, like that, I've brought this skill of being able to now speak a second language. You know, solo travel is not perfect. I think it's totally equally valid to just want to stay in one place, build something, build your life, build a family, build your business, whatever. Those kinds of things are stuff that you need to have stability and roots to progress. You know, one thing that you notice when you meet so many people on the road is that friendships and romances can be fleeting and hard emotionally if you really click with someone and, you know, you're only together for a few days and you have different plans, you have to separate. So what I found myself is that sometimes even when I go into hostels now, I close myself off a bit more just to protect myself from that future pain. You know, another one is that you're going to face tough moments when you're solo travelling, and there's going to be no one there to bail you out in the moment. You're not going to have your pal, your mum, your dad, your family, your friend, whatever. It is just you in that moment a lot of the time. I've been pretty lucky on the trip, not had anything too bad happen to me, but I did get scammed by a taxi driver in Lima, Peru. It's a classic scam. They basically stand outside the airport and say 50-50. So in my mind I was thinking, oh, 50 soles, which is like $10. But of course when I arrive at the hostel and we've had a conversation and it's been nicey and all the rest of it, he then said, go to hand over 50 soles, and he says, no, $50. And he has my backpack in his boot and he's, you know, saying, no, you have to pay. He's locked the car. So yeah, in that situation, luckily I managed to basically stand my ground, haggling down to a much lower price than $50. I think it was like $20 in the end, which was still a rip-off, but at least it wasn't 50. And yeah, when you're in that situation with a phone that doesn't have any data, nothing, you're just like, well, I need to get out of this taxi and this guy is ripping me off, but it's up to you to solve that situation, basically. No one else is going to come and save you. But honestly, even though some of these situations can be challenging while on the road solo traveling, they also forge resilience, real resilience. And this confidence translates into every part of your life. I do feel like once you've walked into enough hostel common rooms and, you know, group tours with lots of new faces, you can almost walk into any new room in life. Before I did this big trip and did little solo trips, I really did feel like it actually helped with my confidence in my work. You know, in my job I was meeting lots of new people, new contractors, new faces all the time on these projects, and having done it lots of times in hostels and new situations, like it just felt like I'd worked that social muscle a lot, and it was easier when I was at work. People who have made it this far might be thinking, so why in your 20s? Honestly, quite a few reasons. For example, in your 20s you have higher energy, higher flexibility, no big responsibilities yet really, and you're still humble enough to do all these cheap things, go into hostels, go into dorm rooms, go on these, you know, rough it a little bit. So in my opinion, this is the prime time to travel solo. I know that everyone's situation is going to be different. Some people might start families in their 20s, X, Y, and Z. I'm just saying your average person in their 20s who's not in a serious relationship, not tied down in any way, who doesn't have any big responsibilities, that this is the prime time to do this kind of solo traveling. You know, and generally in your 30s, I'm not in my 30s yet, but I imagine that it's more of a time where in general that you want to kind of like settle down, start building something, whether that's your continuing on with your career, whether that's finding a partner, whether that's having a family, whatever. Generally, your 30s, especially into your mid-late 30s, is a time to kind of construct something more long-term. You know, this topic reminds me of a chapter from a really great book by Bill Perkins called Die with Zero. And in this chapter he talks about how his friend that he worked with in Wall Street, one of his friends ended up just like taking off and going on a trip to Europe when he was, you know, in his early 20s. Just left his job, actually ended up taking a loan from a loan shark to be able to afford the trip. And he came back in like 4 or 5 months later, but having all these experiences in Europe, having travelled by himself. And when he came back, he went straight into the same job at the same position as Bill, you know, and he hadn't really put himself back in life that much by taking the trip. And Bill had always had the curiosity to do these trips, and he was invited by his friend to come with him, but he just said he couldn't because he had to keep working, he had to keep grinding. Like, this is the time for him to work. So of course that's what he continued doing, and he ended up trying to take a similar trip when he was, I think he said 31, to Europe by himself. But by this time he had quite a bit of money, he had all these luxuries that he was used to, so slumming it in dorm rooms in Europe, you know, going from place to place, eating out of plastic packets, like that wasn't really his style anymore, and he felt too bougie to be in these hostels at his age. That still is to this day one of his biggest regrets, is not accepting his friend's invitation to go on this trip to Europe. So yeah, you have financial costs, but you also have opportunity costs, and your 20s don't last forever. Funnily enough, I think it was this book that actually gave me the final push to decide, right, okay, I'm actually going to do this trip. It was like the final nail in the coffin, was hearing this story from Bill and his regret, basically. So yeah, to close out this video and sort of reflect, I feel that solo travel in my 20s has really, you know, taught me almost more than my time at university, my time at school, my time in work, about life in general, about me. And it really has shaped who I am as a person today. So yeah, if you're in your 20s and even thinking about it, my advice to you is book that ticket.